Tonight, we begin with a story that, just a short time ago, would have sounded unthinkable to many observers of this war. Moscow, the political heart of Russian power, is no longer just a distant command center directing violence outward. It is now unmistakably part of the battlefield itself. As fires are reported, air defenses are activated, and flights are disrupted around Russia's capital, the message carried by this moment is not only military, but deeply political. This war, which the Kremlin has tried so hard to keep geographically and psychologically distant from ordinary Russian life, is no longer staying at the edges. The reported strikes near Moscow represent far more than a tactical episode in a long and grinding war. They signal a psychological rupture that cuts directly into the architecture of power Vladimir Putin has spent decades constructing. From the earliest days of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Kremlin has worked meticulously to separate the battlefield from the capital, to keep Moscow pristine, orderly, untouched, a showcase of stability while violence unfolded elsewhere. That separation was not accidental. It was political. It was designed to reassure elites, calm the public, and project the image of a state firmly in control of events it claimed to have mastered. When activity linked to the war reaches Moscow, even indirectly, that narrative begins to crack. Capitals are not just cities. They are symbols. They embody authority, continuity, and command. For Russia, Moscow is the nerve center where power flows outward, where loyalty is rewarded, where dissent is managed. And where the promise of protection has always been part of the social contract. The mere suggestion that the capital is vulnerable, that air defenses must activate, that security measures must tighten, that daily routines can be disrupted, introduces doubt where certainty has long been carefully curated. This is where perception becomes as important as reality. Even limited or intercepted strikes carry weight when they force a government to acknowledge risk. For years, the Kremlin has insisted that the war would not come home, that ordinary Russians, especially those in Moscow, would be shielded from its costs. That promise has underwritten public acquiescence. It allowed the war to remain an abstraction, a distant operation framed as necessary, controlled, and successful. Once that abstraction erodes, once the capital itself becomes part of the story, the political calculus changes. What makes this moment particularly potent is that it confronts the illusion of absolute control. Putin's leadership brand has always rested on predictability and order. The idea that chaos belongs to the past and instability belongs to Russia's enemies. The image of Moscow as untouchable reinforced that message. When that image is challenged, it does not simply raise security concerns, it raises questions about competence, preparedness, and truth. If the capital can be rattled, what else has been overstated? What else has been hidden? For the Russian public, especially urban professionals and elites concentrated in Moscow, proximity matters. War feels different when it disrupts flights, activates emergency systems, or dominates conversations not as distant news, but as immediate concern. These are subtle shifts, but they accumulate. They make denial harder. They complicate propaganda. They force state media to explain events it would rather minimize or ignore. And every explanation risks contradiction, inconsistency, or exposure. There is also a deeper, historical resonance here. Russian political culture places enormous emphasis on the security of the center. When threats appear to reach the capital, they echo moments of national crisis from the past, moments when leadership was tested not at the borders, but at the core. That does not mean collapse is imminent, but it does mean that symbolic pressure is being applied where it matters most. Power is rarely undone solely by force. It is undone when belief in that power begins to waver. From Ukraine's perspective, the significance of these strikes lies precisely in that psychological dimension. They are not about conquering territory or holding ground near Moscow. They are about signaling reach, resilience, and persistence. They communicate that Russia's depth is finite, that distance does not guarantee immunity, and that the costs of this war cannot be permanently externalized. Even the perception of vulnerability forces Russia to divert attention inward, to defend rather than dominate, to react rather than dictate. Internationally, the implications are just as sharp. Allies and adversaries alike understand that capitals matter. A state that must visibly protect its center is a state under strain, even if its military capabilities remain formidable. This moment invites scrutiny not just of Russia's defenses, but of its narrative discipline. How does the Kremlin explain a war that was supposed to be controlled, distant, and successful when signs of insecurity appear at home? And perhaps most importantly, this moment narrows the gap between official rhetoric and lived reality. When governments lose the ability to fully manage that gap, they enter dangerous territory. Trust erodes quietly at first, then suddenly. The psychological insulation that once protected Moscow from the war is thinning. And once that barrier weakens, it is very difficult to rebuild. That is why these reported strikes matter regardless of scale. They challenge not just airspace, but authority. They test not just defenses, but belief. And in conflicts like this, belief in control, in competence, in inevitability is often the most strategic asset of all. The timing of President Putin's use of the word withdrawal is not accidental, and in the language of modern Russian power, words are rarely chosen casually. In ordinary political discourse, withdrawal suggests restraint, responsibility, even de-escalation. But in the context of this war, it functions less as a military description and more as a narrative tool, a way to soften reality, to lower expectations without admitting failure, and to retain the appearance of control as circumstances become more complicated than originally promised. From the very start of the invasion, the Kremlin framed its objectives with absolute confidence. Ukraine would be subdued quickly. Russian forces would be welcomed or, at the very least, unchallenged. The operation would be limited, precise, and decisive. Those claims were not just for foreign audiences. They were carefully calibrated for domestic consumption. They created a benchmark of success that could not easily be revised without political cost. Every month the war dragged on, that cost increased. So when the language shifts from victory to endurance, from advance to consolidation, from conquest to withdrawal, it signals something important. It is an attempt to redefine success after the fact. Rather than acknowledging that original goals are out of reach, the Kremlin reframes the mission itself. What once was presented as expansion becomes protection. What once was speed becomes patience. What once was inevitability becomes strategy. This rhetorical maneuver is familiar to anyone who studies long wars. Leaders rarely announce defeat outright. Instead, they adjust the vocabulary, hoping the public adjusts its expectations along with it. The danger, of course, is that reality does not always cooperate when battlefield developments, economic pressure, and now even security concerns near Moscow intrude on daily life. Language alone becomes harder to sustain. The word withdrawal also serves another purpose. It creates ambiguity. It allows the Kremlin to speak to multiple audiences at once without committing to a clear course of action. To domestic audiences, it can suggest prudence and care for Russian lives. To international observers, it can hint at restraint or willingness to negotiate. To hardliners, it can be framed as a temporary tactical adjustment rather than a reversal. Ambiguity buys time, and time is often the most valuable resource for a government under pressure. But ambiguity cuts both ways. When leaders speak in vague or carefully hedged terms, they invite interpretation, speculation, and doubt. Russians who were told for years that victory was certain now hear language that sounds defensive, even cautious. That contrast matters. It plants questions that propaganda struggles to erase. If the operation is successful, why redefine it? If the goals are being met, why lower the volume of certainty? This is especially sensitive in a political system built on the projection of strength. Putin's authority has long depended on the perception that he anticipates events rather than reacts to them. Withdrawal, however it is framed, implies response rather than command. It suggests adaptation under pressure, which may be strategically rational, but politically risky in a system that prizes dominance and decisiveness. The timing becomes even more revealing when placed alongside developments that challenge the sense of control at home. As reports emerge of strikes closer to Moscow, as security measures become more visible, the language of withdrawal risks sounding less like strategy and more like concession. Even if that interpretation is unfair or exaggerated, perception drives politics. And perception, once shaped by lived experience, is difficult to reverse. There is also an external dimension to this rhetorical shift. Internationally, Russia faces sustained military aid flow, new tightening sanctions, and growing skepticism about Moscow's long-term objectives. By signaling withdrawal, the Kremlin may be attempting to recalibrate how the war is perceived abroad, not as a stalled invasion, but as a managed conflict with adjustable aims. It is a bid to regain narrative flexibility in a space where options have narrowed. Yet the deeper issue is that words cannot indefinitely mask outcomes. Reframing works only as long as the audience accepts the premise. When people sense that definitions are being rewritten to accommodate setbacks, trust erodes quietly. That erosion does not always lead to immediate unrest, but it weakens the emotional glue that binds public patience to state authority. This is why the language of withdrawal matters so much. It reveals a leadership attempting to balance reality with rhetoric, pressure with projection. It shows a government trying to step sideways without appearing to step back, to manage disappointment without naming it. And it underscores a central tension of this war, the gap between what was promised and what can now plausibly be delivered. In that gap, words become weapons of their own, carefully chosen, strategically deployed, but increasingly tested by events that refuse to stay confined to the margins. Ukraine's growing ability to project force deeper into Russian territory marks a transformation in this war that goes well beyond hardware or tactics. It represents a strategic evolution designed to change how the conflict is felt, understood, and sustained. For much of the war, Ukraine was portrayed, particularly by Moscow, as a reactive actor, limited to defending its own territory and dependent on external support for survival. That framing no longer holds. The reach now being demonstrated tells a different story, one in which Ukraine is shaping the psychological environment of the war as deliberately as it is responding to events on the ground. What matters here is not simply how far a strike can travel, but what it communicates. Depth has always been Russia's assumed advantage. Geography, scale, and distance were meant to insulate the core of the state from the consequences of decisions made at the top. By pushing the conflict closer to that core, Ukraine challenges a foundational assumption of Russian strategic thinking that the costs of war can be exported outward while stability is preserved at home. Once that assumption is questioned, every calculation must be revisited. This shift did not happen overnight. It reflects months of adaptation, intelligence integration, and operational learning under extreme pressure. Ukraine has demonstrated an ability to absorb Western technology, combine it with domestic innovation, and apply it in ways that maximize symbolic and strategic effect. These actions are not random. They are calibrated. The targets chosen, the timing, and the messaging all suggest an understanding that modern wars are fought as much in perception as in territory. For Russia, this creates a new and uncomfortable dynamic. When force is projected deep into its territory, even intermittently, it forces defensive adjustments. Air defense systems must be repositioned. Security priorities must be reshuffled. Resources that would otherwise be used to sustain operations in Ukraine are redirected inward. That is a strategic win even before any physical damage is assessed. Defense, by definition, cedes initiative. There is also the question of confidence. States at war rely heavily on the belief, among elites, institutions, and the public, that the leadership retains mastery over events. Deep strikes undermine that belief not by overwhelming force, but by persistent reminder. Each incident says implicitly, this war is not contained. This war is not predictable. And this war cannot be managed solely on Russia's terms. From Ukraine's perspective, the value of this approach lies in its asymmetry. Ukraine does not need to match Russia strike for strike or city for city. It needs to demonstrate relevance, reach, and resolve. Even limited actions can have outsized impact when they challenge the opponent's sense of security. That is especially true in authoritarian systems, where the projection of control is central to legitimacy. The international audience is part of this equation as well. Demonstrating the ability to strike deeper into Russian territory signals to allies that Ukrainian support is producing tangible results. It reinforces arguments for continued assistance by showing that Ukraine is not locked into a defensive crouch, but is actively shaping the conflict. At the same time, it complicates Russia's efforts to portray itself as unassailable or inevitable. Strength that must be constantly defended begins to look less absolute. There is a restraint embedded in this strategy that is often overlooked. Ukraine's actions appear designed to avoid indiscriminate escalation while still applying pressure. This is not about mass terror or civilian panic. It is about strategic signaling. It is about reminding decision makers in Moscow that their choices carry proximity, that the war they sustain has pathways back to them. That restraint matters because it preserves international support while still shifting the psychological terrain. History offers countless examples of wars turning when one side loses its sense of sanctuary. The belief that the center will always hold is powerful, but once shaken, it rarely returns in full. Ukraine's ability to reach deeper introduces uncertainty where certainty once existed. It forces Russian planners to ask not just what they can do next, but what they must now protect. And perhaps most importantly, it reframes Ukraine itself. No longer just the invaded state, no longer just the defender, Ukraine emerges as an actor capable of initiative under extraordinary constraints. That transformation reshapes how the war is understood, not as a one-sided test of endurance, but as a dynamic contest in which adaptation, perception, and strategic imagination matter as much as sheer force. In wars like this, reach is power, and power, once demonstrated, does not need to be used constantly to be felt. For the Russian public, especially those living in and around Moscow, the war has long been presented as something distant. A controlled operation unfolding far from daily routines, far from morning commutes, school schedules, and evening news that reassured more than it informed. That separation was not incidental. It was carefully engineered. State media, official statements, and tightly managed visuals worked together to keep the conflict framed as external, contained, and necessary, while life in the capital continued largely uninterrupted. Stability was not just promised, it was performed. But disruptions in and around Moscow changed the texture of that performance. When air defenses activate, When flights are delayed or rerouted, when security visibly tightens, the war acquires a physical presence that can no longer be edited out. These moments are not dramatic in isolation, yet they accumulate in the public consciousness. They introduce friction into a narrative built on smoothness and certainty. And once that friction is felt, even briefly, it becomes harder to fully restore the illusion that everything is under control. The power of proximity should not be underestimated. A war feels different when it brushes up against ordinary life. A headline read at a distance is one thing, an alert on a phone, a delay at an airport, or a visible military presence in familiar spaces is another. These experiences do not need to be catastrophic to be politically significant. Their impact lies in the questions they provoke. Why is this happening here? What changed? And perhaps most destabilizing of all, what else are we not being told? A state media faces a dilemma in moments like these: ignore disruptions and risk being contradicted by lived experience. Acknowledge them and risk legitimizing concern. Russian television has long excelled at framing, contextualizing events in ways that minimize threat and maximize reassurance. But framing loses effectiveness when viewers can verify reality for themselves. A delayed flight or a visible security response does not require interpretation. It requires explanation. This erosion of narrative control is subtle, but it matters. The Kremlin's approach to public opinion has never relied on constant enthusiasm. It has relied on acquiescence. As long as daily life feels predictable, many are willing to accept official explanations, even contradictory ones. When predictability weakens, so does patience. People may not protest, but they notice, they talk, they compare notes. And in systems where open dissent is risky, these quiet recalibrations of belief are often where political change begins. Moscow occupies a unique position in Russia's political ecosystem. It is not just the capital. It is a bubble of privilege, access, and insulation. For years, that bubble reinforced loyalty by shielding its residents from the harsher consequences experienced elsewhere. When that insulation thins, even slightly, it disrupts the implicit bargain between the state and its most strategically important population. Comfort has always been part of compliance. The visibility of security measures also carries symbolic weight. A government that presents itself as omnipotent does not want to be seen reacting. Reaction suggests vulnerability. It suggests that events are being managed in real time rather than anticipated in advance. Even if defenses function exactly as intended, their public activation signals that threats are close enough to require attention. That signal lingers longer than any official reassurance. There is also a generational dimension to this shift. Younger Russians, particularly in urban centers, are more accustomed to accessing information beyond state channels. When their lived experience conflicts with official messaging, they are more likely to seek alternative explanations, even quietly. The gap between what is said and what is felt becomes a space where skepticism grows, not rebellion necessarily, but doubt. And doubt is corrosive to systems built on narrative dominance. Importantly, none of this requires widespread panic to be effective. The Kremlin does not lose control because people are afraid. It loses control when people stop fully believing. When the war intrudes on daily life in small but undeniable ways, it chips away at the sense that leaders are fully steering events. Each disruption becomes a data point, a reminder that the story is incomplete. For a government that has worked so carefully to keep the war abstract for its core population, this shift is deeply uncomfortable. Abstraction allows for flexibility, for selective emphasis, for heroic framing. Reality is less cooperative. It insists on being acknowledged, even when acknowledgement is inconvenient. And so, as the war edges closer to ordinary experience in Moscow, the greatest impact may not be measured in damage or disruption, but in attention. Attention once focused elsewhere is now harder to redirect. And once people begin to look more closely, the narratives that once felt solid can begin to feel fragile. Internationally, moments like this are rarely judged only by what happens, but by how a state responds when its assumptions are tested. As reports of activity near Moscow circulate, governments, analysts, and military planners around the world are not simply counting incidents or measuring damage. They are watching for signals. Does Russia escalate rhetorically or militarily? Does it tighten its posture or show restraint? Does it project confidence, or does it reveal strain beneath carefully managed messaging? In geopolitics, reaction is often more revealing than action. For allies of Ukraine, Moscow's response is a critical data point. Western governments have invested heavily, politically, financially, and strategically in supporting Ukraine's defense. They are keenly aware that the trajectory of the war depends not only on battlefield outcomes, but on how Russia adapts under pressure. A measured response could suggest limits, caution, and concern about broader consequences. A disproportionate response could signal insecurity, desperation, or an attempt to reassert dominance through intimidation. Either path carries implications for future aid, diplomatic posture, and risk tolerance. Adversaries and neutral states are watching just as closely, though for different reasons. Countries skeptical of Western influence are assessing whether Russia still represents a reliable counterweight to NATO and the United States. Strength in this context is not defined by bravado, but by coherence. A state that reacts erratically to pressure appears less predictable, and unpredictability makes partners nervous. Even governments inclined to sympathize with Moscow must consider whether alignment brings stability or exposure. This is why escalation is such a delicate choice. Respond too forcefully, and Russia risks validating the very pressure it seeks to deny, reinforcing the perception that its core is vulnerable. Respond too cautiously, and it risks appearing constrained, unable, or unwilling to impose costs. The balance between deterrence and overreaction is razor thin, especially in a conflict already framed in existential terms by Russian leadership. Every missile launched, every statement issued, every exercise announced is read not just for content, but for tone. Global markets feel this tension almost immediately. Energy prices, shipping routes, insurance premiums, all are sensitive to signs that the conflict may widen or intensify. Investors and governments alike have learned to treat Moscow's signals as indicators of broader instability. When uncertainty rises, costs rise with it. That economic feedback loop matters because it adds another layer of pressure on a system already strained by sanctions and prolonged conflict. International institutions are also recalibrating. Diplomatic channels that once seemed frozen are quietly reassessed whenever the balance appears to shift. A Russia perceived as under strain may be approached differently than a Russia projecting unshakable confidence. That does not necessarily mean concessions or isolation. It means options reopen. And for a leadership that has relied heavily on controlling the terms of engagement, the reopening of options can feel like a loss of leverage. There is a reputational dimension here that cannot be overstated. Great powers are expected to manage crisis with composure. They are expected to absorb shocks without revealing panic. When a capital city becomes part of the security conversation, even indirectly, the world listens closely for signs of steadiness. Silence can be interpreted as calculation, but it can also be read as uncertainty. Loud declarations can project strength. But they can also betray anxiety. There is no neutral move. For NATO and its partners, Moscow's response helps shape long-term strategic planning. If Russia appears stretched, forced to divert resources inward, that alters assessments of its capacity elsewhere. If it escalates aggressively, it reinforces arguments that deterrence must be strengthened further. In either case, the trajectory points towards sustained engagement rather than disengagement. The idea that the war can be neatly contained becomes harder to defend. Even countries far from Europe are paying attention. This conflict has become a case study in modern power. How authoritarian systems manage pressure, how narratives hold or fracture under stress, and how military capability intersects with political legitimacy. The way Russia responds now will be cited in policy papers, military academies, and diplomatic briefings for years to come. This is not just about Ukraine, it is about precedent. And hovering over all of this is the risk of miscalculation. History is crowded with examples of states that mistook signaling for strategy, that escalated to restore credibility and instead exposed weakness. That risk grows when leaders feel watched, judged, and boxed in by expectations they themselves helped create. The global audience does not simply observe these moments, it amplifies them. So as capitals around the world monitor Moscow's next move, the focus is not only on what Russia does, but on what its choices reveal. Power is not only the ability to strike, but the ability to absorb pressure without losing coherence. In this moment, coherence is under examination, and the verdict will shape calculations far beyond this war. More broadly, this moment fits a familiar historical pattern in which wars that begin with clarity and confidence slowly bend under the pressure of events that refuse to stay within their original script. At the outset, leaders speak in certainties because certainty is contagious. It rallies support, silences doubt, and creates the impression that outcomes are already settled. The language is bold, the objectives are clean, and the timelines are reassuringly short. This is not just strategy, it is theater. And for a time, the performance holds. But wars are not static. They test assumptions, expose limits, and punish overconfidence. What begins as a controlled narrative gradually encounters reality. And reality does not respect messaging. The first signs are often subtle, a change in tone, a recalibration of goals, a quiet adjustment in language. These are not admissions of failure. They are attempts to adapt without alarming the audience. Yet history shows that once a government starts managing expectations rather than projecting inevitability, something fundamental has shifted. This is especially true when symbols of power are involved. Capitals, command centers, and claims of invulnerability carry immense psychological weight. They are not just locations, They are assurances. They tell citizens and elites alike that no matter what happens at the edges, the center holds. A, when those symbols come under pressure, even indirectly, the promise embedded within them weakens. The war is no longer something happening out there. It becomes something that touches the core, and that proximity changes how people listen to official explanations. History is full of moments like this, conflicts where leaders believed they could control escalation, manage perception, and dictate tempo, only to discover that the war had begun to rewrite its own rules. What makes these moments dangerous is not the immediate damage, but the loss of narrative gravity. Once the original story no longer pulls events toward it, leaders are forced into reactive positions. They are no longer shaping history, they are responding to it. That transition is rarely acknowledged openly. Instead, it appears in language. Victory becomes stability. Success becomes resilience. Expansion becomes defense. None of these shifts are inherently irrational, but together they form a pattern that attentive audiences recognize. Over time, the public learns to read between the lines, to notice what is no longer said as much as what is emphasized. When that happens, authority begins to rely less on belief and more on enforcement, and that is a far more brittle foundation. For strongman systems in particular, this phase is deeply uncomfortable. Power has been personalized, credibility centralized, and outcomes linked closely to a single figure's judgment. When events contradict the image of mastery, the tension becomes personal as well as political. The leader is not just managing a war, he is defending an identity. And identities built on certainty struggle when ambiguity becomes unavoidable. What often follows is an intensification of rhetoric. Statements grow more absolute, threats sound more dramatic. The goal is to reclaim narrative dominance through volume and force of language. But history suggests that escalation in tone cannot permanently compensate for erosion in credibility. Once people sense that certainty is being asserted rather than demonstrated, they listen differently. Compliance may continue, but conviction weakens. That difference matters more than it appears. Another hallmark of this stage is elite recalculation. Political, military, and economic elites are pragmatic by nature. They track momentum, durability, and risk. When symbols of power show strain, elites begin to hedge quietly, not through rebellion, but through caution. Through diversification of interests, through attention to alternatives. These shifts are almost invisible at first, but they are critical. Regimes often appear stable until the moment they are not, and that moment is usually preceded by long periods of silent reassessment at the top. The public experience of this shift is often defined by contradiction. Official messaging insists on control, while lived experience introduces uncertainty. These contradictions do not need to be dramatic to be effective. Small inconsistencies repeated over time, we can trust more reliably than any single shock. When people begin to adjust their expectations downward, the emotional contract between state and society changes. Endurance replaces enthusiasm. Acceptance replaces belief. This is how wars drift into new phases, not with declarations, but with adjustments. Not with collapse, but with recalibration. The danger for leadership is that recalibration, once begun, rarely stops at a convenient point. Each concession to reality invites another. Each redefinition of success narrows the space for genuine resolution. The war continues, but its meaning changes. Globally, these moments are studied carefully. Other states learn not just from outcomes, but from processes. How does a system respond when its assumptions are challenged? How flexible is it? How brittle? These observations shape future alliances, deterrence strategies, and diplomatic calculations. A war that exposes the limits of power in one place reshapes expectations everywhere. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of this phase is that it unfolds without a clear endpoint. There is no single event that marks the transition from confidence to constraint. It happens gradually through language, behavior, and shifting priorities. By the time it is widely recognized, it has already been underway for some time. Wars rarely end when leaders expect them to. They end when the stories that sustain them can no longer absorb the weight of reality. When certainty gives way to management, when symbols of control show strain, and when belief becomes conditional, history begins to move in directions that no single actor fully controls. And once that process starts, it tends to accelerate, not because of intention, but because of momentum. As we close tonight, it is worth remembering that wars do not turn on single strikes or single statements, but on moments when the story of government tells its people collides with what they can see for themselves. When the capital of a nuclear armed state becomes part of the narrative of vulnerability, not invincibility, something fundamental has shifted. The question now is not just how this war is fought on the battlefield, but how it is sustained politically at home. And in the space between those two realities, power and perception, history has a way of moving very quickly.